Tuesday, July 23rd, Robert Kraychik reporting for Rebel News here in Lethbridge, Alberta. Chris Carbert continued testifying today in his and Anthony Olenik's trial. And in his testimony, he rejected certain statements that were made by witnesses invited by the Crown, specifically female undercover operators, UCOs, from the RCMP who had been deployed to Coutts and who had made statements that they had overheard Chris Carbert participate in conversations involving firearms and bombs. When asked about whether or not these conversations took place in the presence of these UCOs, Chris Carbert flatly said no.
The one thing that Chris would not agree on, we did not have a conversation about whether it was guns or bombs that were being delivered. That didn't happen.
Both Chris Carbert and Anthony Olenik are charged with conspiracy to murder. Specifically, the Crown is accusing the two men of conspiring to murder police officers during their time at the 2022 Coutts protest and blockade. The two defendants are also charged with mischief over $5,000 and unlawful possession of a firearm for a dangerous purpose. Anthony Olenik is additionally charged with unlawful possession of an explosive device for a dangerous purpose. The two men have pled not guilty to all the charges against them, and the most severe charge, conspiracy to murder, carries with it a potential life sentence if either of them are convicted. The 2022 Coutts protest and blockade, much like its sister protest, the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa, was a civilly disobedient and peaceful demonstration against this governmental apparatus of surveillance and control and censorship that I refer to as the COVID-19 enterprise. All of these orders and edicts and mandates marketed to all of us as public health measures, ostensibly to reduce COVID-19 transmission. Marilyn Burns, defense counsel for Anthony Olenik, concluded her questioning of Chris Carbert today, and some of her lines of questioning related to the credibility or lack thereof of testimony provided in this trial from several witnesses invited by the Crown, specifically female RCMP undercover operators, UCOs, who made certain factual claims about events as they say they unfolded during their time at the 2022 Coutts protest and blockade. Chris Carbert rejected some of those claims as he sought corrected some of the factual inaccuracies. And this, if accepted by jurors, would undermine the credibility of those female UCOs' testimonies. So I'm here with Danielle. Is it fair to describe you as a concerned citizen, interested party?
Yes, that's correct.
So Danielle's been observing a lot of the proceedings, all of them. She's got a deep insight into what's happening. Danielle, what do you think Johnston was attempting to do, or what do you think is interesting about Johnston's questioning of Chris Carbert when it came to testimony that we previously heard from these female RCMP undercover operatives, these UCOs?
I feel like the defense, Marilyn Burns, when she started her defense, had Corey Toon come up and Corey Turcotte, which proved that the UCOs didn't even know who they were looking at. They had him mixed up with two other people. One was a female. We still don't really know who they were looking at. There was a couple other instances where the defense has discredited the UCOs and what they saw and said and heard. So this today, I believe, was Stephen Johnston's way of recrediting recrediting the UCOs by getting restoring the credit of the UCOs. Yes, by having Carbert confirm things like, oh, what color was their hair, and you're this build, and they said this, and so they were right. They said they went down the hill, so they were right. He kept going over some very basic details about the testimony and basically confirming, oh, they really did know what was going on.
The theory of the case proffered by the Crown thus far is that the two accused, Chris Carbert and Anthony Olenik, allegedly plotted and conspired to murder police officers based on a contingency. That contingency in the case of Chris Carbert was that if police officers began to come after his family to forcefully vaccinate his son, that he would use violence to protect his son from this so-called COVID-19 vaccine. With respect to Anthony Olenik, the contingency was the event in which police officers would begin to open fire on peaceful demonstrators. In video that we saw of Anthony Olenik's interview with an RCMP officer shortly after his arrest on February 14, 2022, Olenik made statements to that effect. There were also text messages that he had sent during his time at the Coutts protest and blockade, which were intercepted by the RCMP and introduced as evidence in this trial, in which he was making similar statements about preparation for violence or expectation of violence with police officers in the event that they began to use deadly force against peaceful demonstrators at Coutts. I observed Chris Carbert maintain a lot of composure during his cross-examination by Stephen Johnston. He maintained a congenial, friendly demeanor throughout the entire process. He never appeared agitated or frustrated or angry. Chris Carbert stated in his testimony today that Chris Sky was viewed as a troublemaker by the Coutts protesters and was perceived to be providing more trouble than he was worth to the overall demonstration when he came to attend the Coutts protest and blockade. Chris Sky became newsworthy in 2020 after certain comments he made about this COVID-19 apparatus went viral, including certain predictions he made about the trajectory of society going forward. He also ran for mayor of Toronto in 2023 and placed 9th with about 1% of the vote total. Chris Carbert also said that Chris Sky was bounced out of the Smuggler Saloon, this restaurant where most of the protesters congregated during their time at the Coutts demonstration. He was removed by Chris Lysak, one of the former Coutts Four defendants, a pretty large guy, 6'4", I think at that time was around 300 pounds. He physically removed Chris Sky from the de facto headquarters of the protesters. Chris Carbert was asked by Marilyn Burns, defense counsel for Anthony Olenik, about text messages that he had sent that were introduced as evidence by the Crown earlier in the trial's proceedings, in which Chris Carbert spoke about the need to maintain peaceable assembly. And she asked Chris Carbert whether or not he did this in pursuit of a peaceful resolution. Carbert said, of course. Chris Carbert repeated testimony today that he made on Friday, in which he said that he sought to achieve a peaceful resolution between law enforcement and demonstrators at the Coutts protest. He was being questioned by Marilyn Burns, defense counsel for Anthony Olenik, about text messages that he had sent during the protest that were intercepted by the RCMP and introduced by the Crown as evidence in this trial. In these text messages, Chris Carbert was calling for maintenance of peaceable assembly. She asked him whether this was part of his overall goal to achieve a peaceful resolution to the overall demonstration. And Chris Carbert said, quote, yes, of course. The one thing that Chris would not agree on, we did not have a conversation about whether it was guns or bombs that were being delivered. That didn't happen. Justice David Lebrenz, the judge presiding over this trial, issued an instruction to the jury today, directing them against arriving at any final conclusions prematurely, given that the presentation of evidence and the overall trial has not yet concluded. Quote, at this point, avoid taking firm positions until the case finishes. You haven't heard all the evidence yet. Lebrenz also reminded jurors that they are the triers of fact and that they will determine, quote, what has been proven and what hasn't been proven, but that their determinations of what is and isn't proven must be, quote, guided by the law. He went on to say that since the jurors have not heard all the evidence yet and specifically have not yet received their instructions from him, which is known as the charge to the jury, they're not yet in a position to have a sufficient legal knowledge to make these sorts of determinations about what is and isn't factual, given that those determinations are guided about the legalities that they have not yet been advised of. The Crown expects to conclude its cross-examination of Chris Carbert tomorrow. It will likely be followed by a re-examination of Chris Carbert by his own lawyer, Catherine Bayak, which may also include Marilyn Burns representing Anthony Olenik. After that, what remains is for all the parties to issue their closing statements and arguments to the jurors, and then for the different parties to have their negotiations, their disputes over how the charge to the jury is composed. And the charge to the jury is a series of instructions that will be given to the jurors by the judge before they retire to deliberate their verdicts. Rebel News had journalists on the ground embedded in the 2022 Coutts protest and blockade. We've been reporting on these events since their inception. We've also been covering them as they unfolded, taking us all the way to here, Lethbridge, Alberta, July 2024, and we're still deeply invested in covering these trials as they unfold. No other news media outlet can claim that. And of course, we're only able to do that because of generous contributions from our beloved and beautiful Rebel News audience. So please help us continue doing this to pursue this journalistic enterprise. Visit truckertrial.com, donate, and stay up to date with our ongoing coverage.